Welcome to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's radical potential. I'm your host, Jordan Corson, and today we have a guest host.
Hi, I'm Eli Meyerhoff.
Welcome back, Eli. So you were a guest on way back on episode 3. I was really excited to have you back because your work on study has been one of the guiding ideas behind this podcast. And you chose a very specific person with whom to engage in a conversation.
I was really excited to talk with Emmaia Gelman, who is a founder and director of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. I was excited to talk to her because this project really exemplifies the kind of radical alternative modes of studying that I talk about in my book, Beyond Education, where I'm looking at kind of conventional modes of studying that people get stuck in the normal education system, where people are kind of shaped into obedient, disciplined subjects for the status quo. But yeah, I've been inspired by Emmaia's work with the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, because it's kind of project that really integrates studying with organizing for supporting the movement for Palestinian liberation and for dismantling Zionist institutions.
Emmaia Gelman, welcome to Another Education is Possible. How are you doing?
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for doing this.
Great. So we have Eli Meyerhoff coming back for a second round here. I think, Eli, you're going to guide us through something that you've done yourself, and I'll kind of be in the background, but you're going to take over. So I'll turn it over to you.
All right. So, Emmaia, what did Judaism and Zionism look like for you growing up?
That is such a complicated question because I'm a New York Jewish kid. So, to some extent, sometimes you hear about people who grow up in Israel, like saying that they don't necessarily recognize their Jewishness as a feature of life because it's all around them. Just like they don't recognize Zionism or the stories that are kind of imposed on their identities. And growing up in New York as a Jewish kid has some similarities to that. I grew up kind of thinking that like everybody was Jewish or Black or Asian, like those were in my school, those were the choices. But at the same time, that I didn't feel like being Jewish was any kind of, particularly marginal or different identity. My particular Jewishness was not the same as the Jewishness of many of the kids in my school. They participated in all kinds of Jewish institutions, Jewish camps, often the Nifties and the Jifties. And I didn't do that. What I came to recognize as my Jewish experience was that half of my family lived in Israel, and I went back and forth all the time. I spent a lot of time there. My cousins and my grandmother spent a lot of time in New York. My father was born in Palestine in 1940, and our family's immigration history was kind of complicated and back and forth to various places. I had a close relationship with family, and with that kind of tension between being an American Jew and looking at Israel all the time and feeling like that was really the location of Jewishness and authenticity. So my experience of Jewishness was through these sort of authenticity questions, which I think a lot of people encounter. Like, was I Jewish or not Jewish because I didn't go to like a Reform temple and, a Jifty camp? Was I Jewish or not Jewish because my family was very closely tied to Israel? It wasn't until I was a teenager that I started to ask questions about Zionism and Palestine. It wasn't that we were Zionist. My parents have never been Zionist. And in fact, turned down opportunities and requests to move to Israel from our family because they didn't think that it was something they could tolerate or something that was right. But we never had conversations about what Zionism was or why it was bad, why it was troubling. And then when I was a teenager, it started to sort of percolate. At the same time as my interest in having a more Jewish education also started to flower. I don't know. I taught myself to read Hebrew. I started looking at prayers, and at the same time, I started looking more critically to understand, like, why were our Jewish experiences or our Israel experiences so like devoid of Palestinians except as laborers. And the real question for me, I'll just sort of leave this here, is at the moment when I started to realize that there was a working class in Israel that was Asian, I started to ask a lot of questions. I was like, wait a minute, I thought this was a Jewish place. Wait a minute, suddenly there's a sort of influx of Asian immigrants in service capacities. They're working for my family. They're like taking care of my grandmother and they're cleaning the house. What's going on here? And then I started to ask also more about Palestinians. So it's a long and convoluted answer, but the real answer is that authenticity and then racism were kind of at the center of my grappling as a kid and a teenager with what it meant to be Jewish.
How did your emerging critical perspective on Israel and Palestine play with your family? Were there tensions, or were they going along with you on that journey?
I think, I'm not a fan of the conversations about Zionism that are sort of Jewish therapy conversations, like, oh, I was a Zionist and then I had to overcome it and it was so hard for me. Like, we have those. I feel like those are private, right? Like like I also don't want to hear about anybody's conversations about how hard it is to not be anti-Black. I just truly don't want to hear about it. Good that you're doing it. Let's not talk about it. My parents, as I mentioned, have never been Zionist. I was surprised when I sort of moved into that conversation that we hadn't had a more overt and deliberate conversation about what's wrong with Zionism, because my parents were anti-racist. I was raised anti-racist. I was raised like as a sort of civil rights movement legacy white kid. So it's weird, I think, that families like mine didn't have those conversations. It's also difficult because I love my family. I really love I grew up with my cousins as very, sort of almost sibling-like. My grandmother, my father's mother, had moved back to Israel after her kids grew up, along with my father's sister. And I loved them and admired them. So on the one hand, breaking with Zionism was something that felt incredibly natural in my immediate family. And on the other hand, it was quite fraught because literally my family was at the center of it. And in fact, they didn't just live in Israel. They are part of the university system. They are part of the cultural and theater system. They had helped build the state. And actually, when I was about 20, I decided that I needed to explore, like, what the hell had happened here. And so I started to interview. I actually missed the capacity to interview my grandmother because she died before I could do it. But I interviewed her best friend, with whom she had started out her life in Palestine in the late 30s. And who also, this friend, her name is Esya Bodashansky, a lovely person, a physician, came from the same village as my grandfather in Romania. And so she was really a part of our family's life. And I started to interview her and ask questions about, like, how on earth did these people who had raised me to be anti-racist and had talked about socialism and liberation done something so horrible and so obviously racist as to be part of this colonial project, and not just a colonial project once, but like again and ongoing and through, moments of really visible and intense repression, as with the intifadas, where it wasn't possible to look away. I did get some answers. They're not satisfactory answers. but we did start to reckon with it as a family. As things progressed, I started to talk to my cousins about like how, their perspectives. I would say they're liberal Zionists. Their perspectives may have changed, but honestly, since the genocide, it has been too difficult to talk or to even think about what our relationship could be like, because it's just too clear how complicit we all are unless we're resisting.
Those are hard tensions. So you mentioned these interviews that you started doing. Was that research related with your studies in college, or how did you start getting into researching Zionism itself?
As I was sort of coming into New York, back from college, trying to be an adult, I was an activist. I was an organizer, and I worked in queer organizing, primarily queer and anti-racist organizing. And that was a place where I met a lot of other Jewish queers, Jewish radical queers were also working on policing. Some of them were working on Jewish stuff, and some of them not. In the course of doing that organizing, I was part of Jews Against the Occupation was a sort of formation that came out of that time. It was sort of a natural conjunction of having come out and having been raised anti-racist, and queer organizing was an important place for anti-racist and other kinds of social justice work. And there were lots of Jewish queers doing that work. Now, I wasn't necessarily doing it in a Jewish way, except that many of my friends were. We were collected around Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, which is an organization that had been started in New York in the 90s by a bunch of Jewish queers and others, particularly in response to the fact that Jewish organizations, mainstream Jewish organizations, had rejected the visit of Nelson Mandela, or didn't want to meet with Nelson Mandela when he was coming to New York after being released from prison, because the ANC had supported Palestinian liberation. When the Second Intifada began, we realized that we needed our Jewish activism to account for that. And Jews for Racial and Economic Justice wasn't so much the place for that. It was not hostile, but it wasn't really doing that work. And so we formed Jews Against the Occupation, which was a little queer-ish, mostly queer Jewish collective that was working on trying to figure out solidarity with Palestine and also trying to intervene in the idea of Jewish consensus. We didn't know that necessarily that there had been a longer history of doing that work. And so there was a kind of a sense that we were building it ourselves. Now, it turns out, of course, that there has always been Jewish anti-Zionist work. And probably it's been very queer, we don't know. So in the course of that, we started asking a lot of questions. It was a real steep learning curve. And that was where this impetus came from. I think that the impetus to study Zionism and to study anti-Zionism is just a natural response to feeling like that knowledge has been denied to us. It wasn't part of my college education. It wasn't part of my first grad school. I went to urban planning school, but by the time I went for a PhD, it was very central, and it was really obvious that the project of rebuilding knowledge that had been erased and submerged was really important. And so that project is partly about building knowledge about Zionism and Zionist organizations, and then partly just about reading more broadly the work that has already been done, much of it by Palestinian scholars, to analyze Zionism.
Was there any particular experience you had in your grad school time that led you to have that focus, or did you have that idea of focusing on Zionist organizations coming into grad school already?
I actually, when I started my PhD program, I intended to finish film. Like, it was the film that asked the question, how could these Jewish elders who taught us to be anti-racist and taught us to be socialist, how could they have done this project, right? Like, the question was really, what's that turn there that allows that to happen? There is some, I don't know, looking askance at what gets called research, right? In academia. I actually don't subscribe to that. I think starting from what you know and what you feel is actually a really important way to do cultural studies. But as I was engaged in the sort of on-ramp research, it just became clear to me that the institutions that were behind it mattered more than the individual instances of experience. At least to me, I wanted to understand what the institutional infrastructure was. And actually the kernel of it was still in the film. So my grandmother emigrated to the United States when she was about 14. She had left Europe when she was about 7, or left her hometown when she was about 7 because of pogroms, but it took her 7 years to get to the United States. What happened in those 7 years, we don't actually know. And then she spent about 7 years in the United States going to high school and going to trade school and graduating really fast, whatever. And then she was recruited, I think by Shomer Hatzair, to become, she went to like a farm training camp in New Jersey. And then she went to Palestine as a pioneer, quote unquote, as a farmer. My guess is that she was interested in escaping the confines of her family home just as much as she was in socialism and getting out, but she was also an idealist and a doer. She was a real doer. So that construction of like, you're gonna be able to be independent and you're gonna go do something that's great and you're gonna be with other, like doer teenagers and you're gonna get away from your parents, that's really powerful. And I wanted to understand where that came from, because the question that I had, and that I'm sure many people have, is was that honest, right? Like, we know that the Zionist project was conceived by a network of people with different ideas, right? So like we have Herzl, who was interested in trying to formulate it as a sort of racial state where Jews could kind of embody European nationalism on their own without facing the discrimination that they faced within European states. We know that Max Nordau was interested in a sort of eugenics, building a sort of like the muscle Jew, as he called it, that was a strong and purified racial strain, and like truly the most disgusting sense of German eugenics. But then we also know that socialists and agriculturalists and back to the land types were also interested in Zionism. So the question is like, who is pulling these strings? Who is moving the pieces into place? So I wanted to understand what the institutional structure of Zionism was and who was really in charge. And at the time, it was really a question of like, how wrong have our people been, right? Like how much bad was in there versus how much were they tricked? How much did they really think something good was going to happen? The nugget of the interview, the main interview from that film project, which I did not complete and may someday complete, is that there was a moment not too long into the interview where Essia said, we started to realize that there was another nation here. And we wondered, like, why aren't they teaching us Arabic? Why aren't we learning Arabic? And we could see that something was wrong. And I said, well, what did you do? Right? Like, it's like the $64,000 question. What the fuck did you do? And she was like, you know what? We didn't do anything because the Jewish National Fund and the Yeshuv, determined what work we could do. They determined where we could live. They determined whether or not we could make a living. And we were stuck, basically, is what she said. Like, we had been brought over. In fact, Essia's family had bought land. I think they were, pretty well off in their home life. And she said, your grandmother, she knew I was asking about my grandmother. She's like, your grandmother had 2 kids. What was she going to do? To me, that's not an adequate answer, right? It's a completely inadequate answer, especially since my family then moved back to the United States and then moved back to Israel as a Zionist state. But it does give some sense that there is a superstructure, a Zionist superstructure that people were navigating, that they were pulled into by a variety of routes. And then once they were there, we're asking a different set of questions about how to negotiate it, which were moral questions and practical questions. And we can really see those operational right now. I mean, maybe this is too far afield for a conversation, but like there's a fucking genocide and no one has stormed the gates. No one has like thrown themselves over the border, right? We're still asking ourselves practical questions and moral questions and making excuses. And, we know with hindsight that these will have been decisions that are too safe and wrong. I think studying the Zionist superstructure, it feels incredibly important and imperative for that reason.
I wonder if, I mean, of course, the answer is just yes, we do need to be more forceful and throw our bodies on the gears of the system. And it's horrifying to see that not happening. I wonder if there's something more personal that you've also encountered. When you started saying that your grandmother's friend is encountering this realization of, oh, why aren't we speaking Arabic? I thought you were going to take that to more of a psychoanalytic thing of this is difficult knowledge. I'm wondering if you also encountered that other people who come to that realization, but then just in a personal way turn against it and say, well, I can't handle that. I can't deal with that.
For a long time, we have, in the world of anti-racism, talked about the importance of looking at structures rather than people, right? So when we say, for example, like ACAB, right? And people are like, what about the police officer who is trying to do good? It's like, it doesn't matter, because what the system that they are operating in is a repressive and violent and racist system. You can't divorce yourself from that by being like the good guy within it. And we've thought about Zionism, or I think about Zionism in the same way, and racism more broadly. It's like, it doesn't matter if you have good intentions. You're doing something that is materially violent and repressive. And we've rejected, in many ways, this sort of psychological, or maybe not even rejected, but like said, we don't need the psychological explanations for it because it's a structure and we're all operating within the structure. In the last couple of years, actually, I would say since the Trump era began, and we've started to look more closely at white nationalism, or what now is called multiracial nationalism, since it's been able to recruit people sort of beyond whiteness into it, and like incel culture, to try and use a more psychological lens to understand what it is that brings people into these spaces. And this is not new, right? The idea of like a psychological wage of whiteness comes to us from Du Bois. There's always been a kind of psychological recruitment element to racism. But in the past couple of years, I think people, not me, but people around me who I respect, have been trying to understand more closely, like what are the psychological conditions that are being produced for us that recruit us into these spaces. And it certainly has something to do with the expansion of like social media and tech. The conditions are not the same now as they have always been, and they need to be understood. When I think backwards about our Zionist ancestors who got us into this mess, I don't think of their responses so much as psychological. I think they were deliberately recruited. Like, the Zionist movement, Herzl was articulated that Zionism would be great for European like leadership elites because it would invite socialists to get the hell out of Europe, right? Like the capitalist sort of elite that was contending with radical movements would be served by it because people would leave. And similarly, anti-Semites would be served by it because Jews would leave. And for those with capital who wanted to invest in it, it would be a good investment opportunity. And for colonial powers, they would be able to sort of dominate in the region. Those are very concrete material enticements of power. Those are not psychological. It may be now that there's more psychological impetus. And I think probably the place to look for that, although it's also very uncomfortable for me to look there, is at the idea of Jewish safety, right? Like the idea that Jewish students on campus, by which I mean actually Jewish students who are not involved in anti-racist organizing, right? You have to be a sort of liberal to right-wing Jewish student in order to be recruited to this, but Jewish students on campus who have really truly felt that when they walk past somebody who is saying like Palestinians ought to have rights, that they are endangered. That is a psychological production. And there's a mechanism that we can identify that produces it. And that's actually one of the things that I've been researching lately, which I think is, it's been helpful. And that mechanism is like there are billboards. There's like multi-million-dollar billboard campaigns that literally tell people that they're unsafe. They tell people also that people who support Palestinian rights are not Jewish and that they're terrorists and that they're regressive and anti-American and anti-democratic. There's a whole package. But they also tell Jews that they're unsafe. And then there are reporting mechanisms where if you feel unsafe, you can, call the ADL or whatever and tell them that you felt unsafe. And then the ADL translates that into a data point that it reflects back and says like, 80% of Jewish students feel, I don't know if that's the right number, right? But like 80% of Jewish students have reported feeling unsafe on campus. And that is a psychological production. And then there are lawsuits, which are brought by lawfare organizations, which sue universities for the fact that Jewish students have felt unsafe. And then universities end up settling those lawsuits for untold amounts of money. So there is absolutely a psychological production. For me, it's not separate from the superstructure because it's deliberately created. And when somebody becomes a victim of that, I have some sympathy, but I'm not particularly interested.
Just thinking about the power of these organizations who are producing these psychological distortions from above, you decided to focus your research on the ADL as a key one of these organizations. I wonder if you could say a little about why you chose to focus on the ADL and what you've learned through that research.
Thank you for asking that question. I feel like my story, I like my story so much, and yet I don't think it's that interesting for writing about it. So thanks for the chance to talk about it. When I was beginning this research, one of the things that had come up in queer organizing was the pushing into queer political, into the queer political space, the idea of gay marriage. When I'm old enough to remember when queers did not care about marriage, nor were interested in marriage. And I remember a very specific moment when we used to read newspapers. I was reading, I think it was Gay City News, the New York City queer newspaper. Maybe it was called LGNY at the time. There was a half-page ad, I want to say from, I don't know, maybe Lambda Legal or the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, as it was called at the time, advertising the urgency of fighting for gay marriage in Hawaii. And I looked at it and I thought, they are trying to sell us marriage. It's a good thing nobody cares about marriage, right? But it worked, right? They really sold us that gay marriage was the issue that we needed to focus on. And then as we sort of progressed through legislative battles and ballot measures, there was another moment of turn where Proposition 8 in California had sort of gay marriage on the ballot, and gay marriage was, rejected. And many, not all, but many popular voices, loud voices, organizer voices within the marriage movement, who were white voices, let's be honest, blamed Black voters and said, like, how is it that queers have stood up for Black people for so long, and now it's our turn, and Black people have not stood up for our turn for civil rights? No, aside from the overt racism and crassness of that, and also the sort of counterfactual ahistoricalness of that claim, the idea that white people who were largely, in that instance, middle class, who were trying to get married in order to be able to do things like, inherit each other's estates. In addition to things like immigration and healthcare, that the framing was that powerful people who are already relatively powerful are looking at somebody else and saying like, our rights are exactly the same as your rights, and to us the denial of this recognition is exactly the same as the denial of recognition to you. Basically I think of it as a white rights argument. Okay, so that's a lot of background. In the context of the efforts by largely Zionist organizations to assert anti-Semitism as a kind of like anti-Blackness experience, the same question comes up. Like, here's a set of people who are comfortably middle class. The police, when you call the police do what you ask. They don't come and shoot you, right? And here we are trying to make the claim that these two things are the same. Where did that come from, right? Like, where does this instrumentalization of the idea of rights come from? Okay, that's a very long answer to where did my interest in the ADL come from. But the ADL really forged the hate crimes framework. It didn't invent it. The initial impetus for hate crimes laws came from waves of white nationalist violence that were supremely anti-Black and anti-immigrant and also anti-queer. There were catastrophic events. People's homes were burned. People were set on fire. People were shot by snipers, right? People of color and queers we're talking about. But the ADL had been interested in trying to like elevate the idea of anti-Jewish graffiti, swastika graffiti, or like sort of statements, and saw the opportunity to connect that impetus with the catastrophe of white nationalist violence that was targeting people of color and queers. And so they generated hate crimes model legislation and they put it forward, and it was actually really, useful and successful. I should say that the reason that people of color and queers were interested in having hate crimes legislation that exceeded what was already, the criminalizing of violence was because police always refused to respond whenever such violence happened. And in fact, often police were perpetrating it. Anyway, so the ADL and to a certain extent, the American Jewish Committee were able to sort of, because they had the capacity to write state legislation and they had legislative relationships and they had carried a lot of weight, were able to come and sort of create this hate crimes framework that did what communities of color and queer communities needed, but also wrote into it, I would say, lesser incidents, like, scrolling a swastika on a bathroom door is not the same as burning down somebody's house. This equation of something happened to me and something happened to this other person without looking at how power is involved, without looking at what the positionality of the person who is being targeted is, or the fact that that hostility toward them might actually be generated by their position, was really important. It turns out that once you open the door to the ADL's history, there's so much more.
I wonder if you could give us a little more historical context on when and why the ADL was forging this hate crimes framework at that time.
It's not random. The ADL's history is a combination of response to like really, really big global power events and also just kind of stumbling into stuff, right? So in the 80s, I don't know, there were some conditions that were concerning to the ADL. Anti-Semitism on the whole had kind of diminished. Jews had somewhat withdrawn from Jewish organizations, partly because they were better situated and, didn't necessarily feel like they needed to be represented by Jewish organizations. The state of Israel was losing its shine, I guess you could say. Through wars, through the Sabra and Shatila massacre, through the election of Menachem Begin, who is an overt racist and right-wing operative, like the idea that Israel was an underdog or a socialist project was gone. The Black Power movement had identified Zionism as colonialism, and the idea that Jewishness, if Jewishness was to be connected to Zionism, the idea that it was kind of the same as a racial liberation project as people in the US understood, like the civil rights movement, was also diminished. So they were kind of in an emergency of like losing their street cred. At the same time, Arab Americans were constructing their own ethnic politics in a more deliberate way than they ever had. So for the ADL, reconstructing the idea of anti-Semitism as a crisis and reconstructing a Jewish victimology that could be tied to the state of Israel and invite support for the state of Israel was really important. In 1974, which is about, half or 3/4 of a decade before the hate crime stuff really took off, they published a real articulation of this idea that now that Jews had kind of been included in the social and economic structures of whiteness in the United States, they didn't use the term whiteness, that the left that was opposing the interests of the establishment, by which they meant both like corporate power and the Vietnam War and the state of Israel, was being anti-Semitic because those were Jewish interests. And then the case that they made was that even if they didn't think they were being anti-Semitic or say they were being anti-Semitic, that they were unconcerned with it and therefore being anti-Semitic. And they tied that to the conception of the left as being like anti-democratic and racially intolerant, which was how they described the Black Power movement and transnational movements against colonialism. Between like the mid 70s and the mid 80s was a time when the ADL in particular, because its stock in trade was claims about civil rights, needed to reassert Jewish marginality. And so hate crimes laws served as an amazing platform for that. They also did other work, like the Black Power movement, the sort of long tail of the civil rights movement had really made clear that racism could not be understood in terms of skin color, but that it was structural and that it had everything to do with capital and colonialism. And changing that conversation so that instead of talking about racial capitalism or whatever, we were going to be talking about how one person did something mean to another person was pretty powerful as a way to deconstruct that analysis. And it really invited people. I mean, like if you look at how much people, different groups needed to be included in that in order to be recognized as suffering, right? So like queers really have bought into the hate crimes framework. There were hearings throughout the 80s that, where everybody wanted to be sort of tagged in, right? It's like there's an Asian American hearing, there was an anti-Indigenous violence hearing, there were hearings on anti-Black violence. There was a hearing on anti-Arab violence, actually, in which the American Jewish Committee showed up and said, it's not racial, it's political. So everybody felt compelled to plug into it, and it became incredibly powerful. And as scholars of hate crimes law have told us, particularly Dean Spade, who's done a lot of work on this, the actual impact of them was that they increased policing, they increased incarceration, and those effects were targeted they weren't targeted at those who were attacking people of color and queers. They actually incarcerated and policed people of color and queers primarily.
I wonder if you could bring us a bit to the present and talk a little about how this shift towards a hate crimes framework understanding of racism pushed by the ADL has influenced the repression of the Palestine movement in the past couple decades up to the genocide today.
One of the things that has been most powerful about the hate crimes framework, is that it really puts an affective and emotional and outrage spin, I guess, on the idea that one person would attack another for their identity. I'm not saying I think people should attack each other for their identities, but it has created a powerful tool. And wherever there's a powerful tool, powerful forces take it and leverage it, right? And so in the post 9/11 era, as we like to call it, in the era where the United States has been consumed with securitization and anti-terror law, and the idea that the nation is under siege and under threat and needs both militarized policing and surveillance in order to protect. the hate crimes framework has become an instrument for that work. So the idea that anti-terror law, this war on terror, gives to us is that like they hate us irrationally, they being the outside world, particularly presumably the East hates the West, right? That's an old clash of civilizations framework. And that allows that allows anti-terror law and securitization to use the idea of hate rather than looking at like, well, what might people be actually saying is wrong with the United States? What is the impact that the United States is having elsewhere? What actually is the US Army doing in Iraq, Afghanistan, myriad other places? So to be able to sort of wipe all of that off the table and translate instead the idea that this is an irrational hatred of the United States, and of people who are protected within the United States, like they hate queers, they hate Jews, right? They hate these sort of figures who have been protected by U.S. liberalism. Has been a really powerful like affective way to invite the United States population to support those kinds of measures, policing measures. In the last couple of years, that has been actually, the idea of hate has been stitched in law to anti-terror prosecutions. And hate crimes add penalties, right? That's the whole idea of this framework, is that if you call something a hate crime, it adds penalties. People who perpetrate what's now called terror or hate are increasingly people of color, people who are opposing racism, people who are opposing police violence. The Biden administration, in its revision of the domestic terror laws and frameworks, included people who have anti-capitalist ideation. They were trying to get at environmental activists, Black identity extremists, which means like people who are too anti-racist. That's right. So those groups of people who have been incorporated under anti-terror law are now, if you can construe them as hating, are also now subject to other additional penalties. In the context of Palestine solidarity work, if this anti-terror law has been doubled and tripled in its capacities, because the idea is that people who say the word Palestine are committing acts of hate against Jews. It is incredibly powerful and as an erasure, right? It's an erasure of the idea that Palestinians have rights, that Palestinians are a racialized group, that Jews are part of the Palestine solidarity movement, and that the people who are most talking about anti-Semitism are actually right-wing, primarily right-wing or anti-rights groups. The only way that makes sense to the US public is through the pathways that we've been taught to think about hate and hate crime. If we were talking about civil rights, if we were talking about structural power, it would be obvious that Palestinians and, say, students, right, are the subjects of repression. But when we talk about hate, it becomes very abstract. And the idea of an abstract hostility replaces our analysis of material harm. I'll just gesture to one article about that, which is, I think, really helpful. Heike Schotten and John Harfouche have an article in the first issue of the Journal for the Critical Study of Zionism, called Notes Toward a Theory of the Anti-Semitism Industrial Complex. It looks at the work of Fayez Sayegh, who is a Palestinian philosopher and political organizer in the 50s and 60s and 70s, actually. And it just explains exactly how that works, how the idea of an abstract feeling of harm comes to replace the real material harm of state violence.
This line of questioning about the hate crimes framework's power for repressing protests, back to your own experiences working in the university and teaching. I wonder if you could talk about how you've seen that sort of discourse used as a weapon of repression of Palestine activists in your university workplaces.
I guess it's taken different forms. The three things that come most to mind are these. One, as I was applying for funding for my research, which of course every grad student and academic has to do in order to kind of legitimate their work, I kept getting rejected, right? And finally, someone very close to me and helpful and not a Zionist suggested that I try to excise the word Zionist from my applications, like to look at the ADL, to say I'm looking at the ADL, but not mention that it's a Zionist organization. It's like, how can I do that? How can I talk about this work that I'm trying to do, which really looks at Zionism as a power structure without mentioning Zionism? I didn't do that, and I did not get any funding for it. But I thought that was an interesting analysis, right? It wasn't that the people who were reading the applications were necessarily like super pro-Israel. It's just that they had no language for understanding Zionism as a power structure, and therefore mentioning it felt extreme. The second instance is, of course, the enormous repression that students have experienced as they protest on campuses, which, it's not just my experience, although it certainly was happening. I was teaching at Sarah Lawrence, and there was a really wonderful and beautiful movement, Students for Justice in Palestine, as well as there was Jewish Voice for Peace. There were like socialist formations on campus, and they were all working together. And they were the largest student organization on campus at all. Sarah Lawrence is a pretty depoliticized campus, and Palestine really galvanized like the whole world. And I wouldn't say that at Sarah Lawrence that they were repressed in the same way that they were at other schools, ignored, marginalized, and treated as sort of irrelevant by an administration who really saw its job as sort of like keeping everything normal, right? The last thing and most obvious example, I think, is the adoption by some universities of the idea that Zionist is a protected identity, right? That happened after a full year of all of this discourse. It's on its face bananas. Zionist is, first of all, a politics. Second of all, it's about a state, like a literal state. And third, every campus, even if you wanted to believe that Zionist should be a protected identity, every campus is full of Jewish students saying like, hello, we're anti-Zionist Jews and no one is protecting us, and everyone who in a position of authority is trying to tell us that what it means to be Jewish is to be Zionist, which is like a clear violation of civil rights. It's anti-Semitic, it's all kinds of things, and has had no purchase. So I think that's the criminalization of not being Zionist, I think, is the clearest example of how the discourse of hate has become a militarizing and punitive force against the people it purports to protect.
Thinking from a more hopeful perspective, in these struggles of the Palestine Solidarity Movement and against these Zionist organizations that are pushing all of this propaganda that's deflecting attention from the genocide and legitimating the genocide. I wonder what movements or particular struggles, what gives you hope?
So we have this new podcast on the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. It's part of a mini series in our Unpacking Zionism podcast, and it's called From Above. It's about Zionist institutions looking at exactly at their sort of role as superstructure. But the term from above came to us through the work of Hil Aked and their amazing book, Friends of Israel, The Backlash Against Palestine Solidarity, which looks at Zionist organizations as kind of a social movement from above. The other thing that happens when the movements from below get too strong is that they become repressive, that they simply try and curtail the rights that have been won before in order to stop movements from proceeding. And in those instances, it kind of falls to us to recognize that the rights that we won before are not it, right? Like we need to enact them, we need to practice them, but they are not the sum total of what we can have, or they don't necessarily describe the hegemony that we're looking for. And particularly, we'll find ourselves, it's so interesting that they've written this, they will find ourselves in the position of defending institutions that are not actually the institutions that we want, right? The university being case in point, right? Or, people have been out in the streets saying like, defend the courts. Like, really? Defend that, the carceral system? But we're in these sort of contradictory positions where, because we're under such repressive attack, we are both required to exercise the rights that we've won already and to imagine what else we want, and to keep pressing for what else we want. The student movement, which I don't want to like over glamorize, but it has been such a cauldron of refusal to accept the terms that are offered for like making everything go back to normal, refusing to separate the fate of student protesters from an end to the genocide in Gaza and increasingly the West Bank, calling on us to think about like maybe not saving the university, right? Like maybe the university doesn't hold what we need. I think that these are invitations that people have really, really taken up. I mean, because we've all been so inspired by the student movement. Now I think people have really understood that Zionism is a power structure that operates in the United States as well. And that it is both its own thing and it's being instrumentalized by a whole other set of right-wing forces that really don't give a shit about Zionism, but find its pathways usable. And I think being able to talk about that is incredibly promising, and being able to think past, like restoring order is incredibly promising. That comes both from the student movement and from the resistance in Gaza. The idea that people are not only continuing to resist their own destruction, but also continuing to educate themselves and insist on schooling, to insist on culture. People refusing to move when they're told to move because there's no point in following those orders. The refusal is where we're going.
I wonder if there's a tension there in your work, the broad project of unpacking Zionism, but particularly, I would imagine it can be quite laborious to always talk about from above, and yet what you're talking about is that hope comes from below. So I wonder if you're pulled in those different directions of like, oh, who gives a fuck about? I mean, of course, the important thing is to say like, let's dismantle the ADL and systematically explore this, but wouldn't it be more powerful and honestly just more fun to move from below?
Everybody has their job, right? I think that the research on how power operates is essential. And I'm excited to be doing it. And I'm excited to do it to make sure that the conversations about it are coming from below. This is one of the things that became so clear as I started to try and research Zionism more deeply, is that there's all this writing that comes from Palestine that I had never encountered. Like research on Zionism, not just about like its effects, but like how it works. I didn't know that because I was educated in a Eurocentric system. Having that vantage point on power, I think, is incredibly important. So we are actually doing this research from below, and it's for movements and in conversation with movements. I believe so much in the importance of joy and the importance of building spaces in our movements where we can actually live and not just moan, but actually I'm better at moaning myself. I'm better at like complaining. So I'm trying to occupy my role well, and then take my lessons from people who are better at joy and try and incorporate them.
I wonder if you could speak a little about how the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism might play a role in facilitating this research from below, and whether and how the Institute is grappling with these kinds of tensions of resisting the Zionist movement from above while supporting Palestine solidarity research and movements?
The Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism is a research and education organization that also, by necessity, has become an organization for defending research and education. We formed because of the need to be able to study Zionism, and particularly, in the US and the Western context, academic spaces for doing that kind of work are quite limited. So Jewish studies and Israel studies have been the focus of an enormous amount of funding, Zionist funding, some from Zionist donors, some coordinated by the Israeli state, over a long period of time. And so as the neoliberal university becomes increasingly and has become increasingly dependent on outside and private funding, that influence has become baked into the study of Zionism, really. Like the idea that those who, like if you want to study Zionism, you ought to be in a Jewish studies or an Israel studies department. And that if you are looking at Zionism from outside, from the space of like a settler colonial studies perspective, or like a, critical race theory perspective, even, that you are kind of intruding and maybe anti-Semitic, right? Those are the frameworks that have been set up. And that's, how can we do that? How can we study a power structure when the places from which we're trying to study it are aligned with it? Like, we can't do that. I mean, you might say in that case, you can't study it from within the university, which is another, we're always trying to find our fugitive spaces. But the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism is a place to do that research that is both connected to academia, because many of us, not all of us, actually have some relationship to academia. Many people who are involved in the Institute are faculty, many are students, some are staff, but also to value and incorporate and build in research that's coming from organizers and from people who are on the ground, right? Like we have this sort of like prioritization of academic research as if it's neutral, right? Like that is the claim, right? As if it's neutral. If it's peer reviewed, then it must be factual, right? But we see there's just, prodigious bullshit coming out of Zionist, sites of scholarship. I'll give you one example, actually, my current favorite example. So the American Jewish Yearbook is a very important document in Jewish studies, Jewish history, also Jewish communal life, right? I can't remember when it started coming out, a long time ago, many, many years ago. And it's a place where, for the documentation of what's going on in the Jewish world. There's an academic, her name is Sylvia Barak Fishman. She is a fellow with ISGAP, which is the Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism and Global Policy, or something, a super right-wing organization that gets treated as a verifiable source. I don't know. Anyway, so she's an academic, she's a fellow with this organization, and she wrote in the 2025 American Jewish Yearbook, she was writing about what Zionist organizations have framed as the anti-Semitism crisis around the war. And she wrote about the Institute. She wrote about the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. I think she pulled something from our website. Okay, that's factual. And then she said that it's run by Emmaia Gelman, who was a co-founder of If Not Now and the Palestinian Youth Movement, which is news to me. I don't know. Like literally Google it, right? Like you just Google it, Sylvia. So that's the kind of stuff that passes for scholarship in the world of Zionist funded research organizations. Obviously, it's not a place where we can do the kind of research that we need. So the Institute was created as a place to do that research, and also to support, to build a community of researchers. It's our intention to fund research. We're still working on that. And to provide some of the mentorship and like learning opportunities that ought to be provided by universities, but are often missing. And that if somebody tried to provide them, that universities might yank the funding by by saying that it's a violation of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And so we have this mission also of trying to popularize and provide in a non-academic way the knowledge that's coming out of organizing and academic research. And so we have this podcast, Unpacking Zionism, which has been, wow, a hell of a project, and also very super interesting. We have had 3 series so far. One is a keyword series where we're trying to like offer kind of keywords for thinking about Zionism as a power structure. The idea of keywords comes from a sort of textbook, academic textbook approach to taking one word that may be misunderstood or maybe, unfamiliar, and trying to explain it in a way that situates both where the word comes from and how it's operating. So we've had keywords like, some of them are real straightforward, like we've had Zionism and anti-Zionism. We've also had keywords like visual culture or future. Our current series is called From Above, and that is looking at individual Zionist institutions. But again, looking at them from below, from the way that they are, the way that they're experienced from below, and through some research.
I'm wondering, and thinking about how universities, especially the administrations of universities, have been so complicit with spreading propaganda that the ADL and other Zionist organizations, like especially Hillel International on campuses, university administrations have spread this narrative about a culture of anti-Semitism on campuses as a means to repress the protests and distract attention from what the Palestine solidarity protesters are trying to direct people's attention to. Propaganda was spread by administrators during the Biden administration. Then with the election of Trump, Trump has continued using that narrative about a culture of anti-Semitism on campuses as an excuse or kind of wedge for pushing a right-wing agenda within universities, a right-wing agenda that's taking funding away from universities, it's dismantling DEI programs, taking funding away from public health research. The legitimacy of that kind of mode of doing academic university kind of project is really brought into question. I'm just wondering how you see your institute's approach as possibly intervening in this time of crisis for universities. How can it, or do you see it as offering some kind of alternative and entering this kind of space of crisis and struggle?
There are two things that you're pointing to here. One is the need for independent research organizations that are not subject to the strictures of the university. And the other is the confusion about liberalism. Let's just call it that. I think because, as you're saying, what it has been confusing, I think, to observers in the public sphere, I think, to see universities that have been defined as liberal, really, as suddenly becoming partners in this right-wing project. What we're seeing is like the actual nature of liberalism, which is, even though there's a sort of not that deep commitment to the idea of inclusion and to the idea of like hearing from multiple voices and freedom to explore or whatever, but it is all quite limited. It's delimited and bounded by the strictures of capitalism. When our questioning starts to actually transform something, that the bosses come in and discipline the changes that we're trying to make. I think we're just sort of pushing up against the limits of what gets called US democracy, which, people have been pushing up against those limits for a long time, just maybe not so much on university campuses, right? It's I think a widely shared analysis at this point that university administrators who were asked and invited by Zionist organizations to do this kind of repression and given the tools to do it, like here, implement this policy and say, call it, a way to oppose anti-Semitism, or like pretend you're protecting academic freedom by actually clamping down on academic freedom, that administrators who accepted those invitations from Zionist organizations were not necessarily being pressured to do it, but we're actually finding that we're actually welcoming those measures and used the excuse of, oh, well, these quote unquote Jewish organizations are asking us to do it for the protection of Jews as their pathway to do it. I think that it's important to conceive of university administrations as like a multiplicity, right? There's no one thing, and people are motivated by lots of disparate disparate factors. They might be motivated by like a personal relationship with a donor. They might be motivated by like they were mad, they already didn't like the university senate, and here's a way to clamp down on it. We don't know, right? It's lots of converging circumstances. But it is clear that Zionist institutions handed university administrators ways to do things that many were already interested in. It's also clear that many of the actors who were involved in that, including Zionist institutions themselves, didn't necessarily mean for it to go this far. Like we've seen when students began to be abducted, when Mahmoud Khalil was abducted, and then Ramesa Öztürk was abducted, we began to see some of the same organizations that had called for the repression of students say, let's make this a little bit less, crimey, right? Like yeah, sure, we want these students to be deported, but they should have due process in the course. Even the Anti-Defamation League said that. The Anti-Defamation League, which had called for the National Guard to be brought in to police students, which is basically an invitation for like another, Kent State or Jackson, like massacre of students. Getting back to the idea of what the Institute does, I think the idea is there are many, many parts of the university that are liberatory, right? They may exist in spite of those administrators and in spite of the repressive policies. That's faculty and staff for justice in Palestine is an example of that. It started like a year ago, and it already has like 200 plus chapters. Like people are hungry for this. But to be able to preserve and build that impulse, we need something that's independent, right? Like a home for people who are trying to do this work. It would be great if the Institute did not have to be outside of the university structure forever, but I don't know if that's the case. And I will say that we're part of a welling up, I think, of independent research and education organizations. We've seen that over the last couple of years. I mean, it didn't just start with the genocide, but it has really been fueled by the genocide. So some of those, like Al-Shabaka, the Palestine Policy Institute, the idea of creating, right, like an analytical scholarly structure for research and analysis from Palestine that speaks into a global academy, I think has been really important, and global politics. There is the Institute for the Understanding of Anti-Palestinian Racism, the Palestine Policy Institute. There's the brand new Institute for the Study of Christian Zionism, which has confusingly a very similar acronym to ours. There's a new network of liberated Jewish studies scholars. There are Scholars for Social Justice, which is a broadly anti-racist, Black and Brown-led scholar effort. Yeah, there's a whole bunch. So I think that this idea of creating a space where we can do the work that the university should be doing, but we're not subject to it, is a kind of commonly shared impetus right now.
I wonder if you're taking on any new modes of doing this kind of research in relation with movements, like new alternative modes of researching and organizing that contrast with the normal way of doing things in academia, like, for example, around peer review.
We have a peer-reviewed journal, the Journal for the Critical Study of Zionism, which is really committed to mentorship, which I think is different from how other organizations work. We just had our first open CFP, and the response was pretty overwhelming. There's clearly a need for a space and a supportive space for people to publish research that's anti-Zionist. And I should be clear that one of the foundational parts of the Institute is that we have points of unity that just sort of articulate where we're starting from, right? In truth, every organization is starting from somewhere and has some sort of bottom lines. They don't usually articulate them. So I think this was our effort to be like pretty straightforward and not hide them. Of course, we've been attacked for having points of unity by Zionists who say that if we start from any basic ideas that we're excluding them. Yeah, old right-wing tactics. Anyway, our points of unity include, like, we're not going to debate whether Zionism is good, actually. Zionism is a form of settler colonialism, so is the United States, right? And also, we are not going to do this sort of hierarchical thing where only senior research scholars or senior scholars get to do research and everybody else is just sort of pretending we're not doing that. So we have this invitation to scholars who have been trying to do this work, and probably mostly in the context of Western universities, and not been supported. that means to some extent, there's writing and research that needs a home to be published. That's brilliant and urgent. To some extent, it means that people have not necessarily had the chance to develop their research proposals as much as they would like to. And so, like some abstracts that have come in, like are really wonderful seeds and need more discussion. And so okay, we'll try and provide that. We also had a student mini conference where students were able to present their research and get feedback from, in this case, it was like senior scholars who are experts in the field, so that they have some of the backing that may be missing in their home universities. One of the fun pieces of it, I guess, is that we're building a Zionist hate mail archive where we are inviting people to send us the hate mail that they have gotten from Zionists, whether organizations or people. And the reason for that is that hate mail is normally accrued in private, right? Sometimes people post it, but usually it's in private. Usually we just try and absorb it and let it go, or let it roll over us. But it actually means something. It's generated by individuals, often who are activated by a less visible structure. In the past, there was the act.il app, which encouraged people to send to shit post about anti-Zionist stuff or to send complaints. I don't think that exists anymore, but there are certainly calls to action. There have been calls to action around ethnic studies by Zionist organizations opposing ethnic studies, which have produced prodigious amounts of hate mail for individual ethnic studies scholars, almost exclusively scholars of color. And those hate mails are racist and misogynistic and anti-immigrant and also inaccurate, right? So we want to collaboratively study what it means that this kind of sort of apparently stochastic attack constitutes a racial and ideological framework.
That seems like a powerful way of interweaving research with organizing, because I could see, I've experienced myself how receiving hate mail, hate emails, hate tweets is a weapon that our opponents use to make us feel more fear and anxiety about engaging publicly around these issues. And yeah, I could see how collaboratively studying with other people who are receiving this kind of hate attacks could be a way to break out of that sense of immobilization.
It's also the difference between Zionism in public and Zionism in private, right? It's they really are very different. And we want to understand what it means that Zionist organizations and people mobilize certain arguments, in the light of day, and then revert to other arguments.
I think it's interesting to go back to our earlier discussion about the ADL's project of redefining racism in this individualized hate crime framework, to think of what you're doing with the ICSC and this collaborative project around hateful mail, emails, messages, and you're approaching this hate in a very different way, where you're tracing it to the structural and institutional forces that are perpetuating it. You're kind of de-individualizing it in a way.
Yeah, that's the idea, is we don't have to take Zionism on the terms that it's delivered to us. That's exactly right.
Maybe to draw to a close, I wonder, Emmaia, if you could say a little about what you're excited to be working on now.
It's hard to call it excited. I mean, I am excited. I actually am doing the work that I really want to be doing and feel like it's important. I have a forthcoming book on the Anti-Defamation League. It's a critical history of the ADL from its founding through about 1990. And it's been a long time in the works, as my children would annoyingly remind me. It looks at the ADL as a Cold War organization and at its relationship with anti-racist movements, which, as you can imagine, has been quite fraught. Anti-racist movements and leftist movements, and really looking at the ADL as a disciplinarian of the left, which I think we're much more inclined to recognize that in the present. But when I started writing it 15 years ago, that was much less obvious. And I hope that I can provide some context that can help people understand now what they're seeing. It's tough. I will refer people in the interim to droptheadl.org, which is where a lot of the research and materials that have been contributed by movement organizers over the last couple of years are stored. It's at the same time, of course, really hard to be excited about it because every single day we fail to stop the genocide. We failed to stop the bombs and the starvation and the machinations between the Trump administration and Netanyahu and all the other bad actors at the top of power structures around the world. I am hopeful that this work can increasingly is powering some resistance. When we started the podcast, we realized that, there was sort of a need for political education and public education, and we were doing it piece by piece. And now there's a body of work, right? So to a certain extent, we've built kind of a curriculum. I mean, we're still building it, and I wouldn't say it's been as deliberate as a curriculum might be. But the Institute has built just a huge library of resources. And at the same time, there are all these other organizations that have built huge libraries of resources. The Arab Studies Institute, for example, has built a very deliberate and specific syllabus and materials and talks, which are also archived on their website. There's just a huge production of resources studying Zionism, anti-Zionism, anti-Palestinian racism, colonialism, militarism, and how all of these things are interwoven with other issues that we also are working on all the time, climate and indigenous rights and gender. So I think that this is actually an incredibly rich moment for understanding and uncovering, that Zionist education and PR basically has been doing for the last 80 years or longer. So I'm really hopeful about the kind of shared turn that we're taking. Particularly for the Institute, we are building relationships with scholars who are working in other contexts. We've been pretty US and Palestine focused, largely because that's where the people are who started it. We have been doing some work in Australia and some work in Europe, not really enough. I'm super, super excited about beginning to work with South African scholars and with South American scholars and activists in both places, and to try and expand from there so that we really decenter the United States, which is hard for me to think about because I'm so US-centric. I'm such a New Yorker and such an American, despite my best intentions. Really excited for the way that Palestine is making us move. And it feels like it's not only undoing Israeli colonialism, but also US colonialism, and particularly in the realm of knowledge production, but also in other ways. So yeah, I think the thing that I'm most excited about is the expansion of our vision, like not the Institute's vision, but like our collective vision. We've been pretty myopic in the United States, and I'm excited to let go of that.
Today's episode was produced by Yardain Emran, Samantha Haley, and me. Music by Yardain. If you like our podcast, please rate us, like us, follow us. We're also on Instagram at AnotherEd If you're interested in learning more about Emmaia Gelman's work or learning more about Eli's work, we'll be posting links on our Instagram. Thanks as always for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Another Education is Possible.